Welcome to Keen on Green with Evan Rigsby, the podcast that dives deep into the world of environmental consulting from a multitude of perspectives. Join your host, Evan Rigsby, as he explores the intricate challenges and innovative solutions within the environmental sector.
Hey everybody, it's Evan Rigsby from Keen on Green, and we are back. Today we have a very special episode, and today I'm bringing to the podcast Tim Ashmore, who, when I think of power players in our industry and people who are active in our community and are really making a difference, Tim comes to the top of my mind. Tim is from CDM Smith. He is the client service leader for industrial, working in the energy sector, working with sustainable processes, working with different key stakeholders. Tim is doing it all. So today I'm really glad to have Tim on board. He's going to talk a little bit about his career, what he's done, his thoughts on the industry. Tim, thanks for being on with us today.
Yeah, I really appreciate the introduction. Hopefully I can live up to that here today. But excited to join you, Evan, and appreciate the dialogue we've been able to develop.
So, a big thing for us, Tim, and a lot of people who listen to the podcast is people, not only seasoned experts like yourself, but really individuals that are in college right now, thinking about getting into the industry, or even young professionals. So, I know your story, but for those who don't know, can you talk a little bit how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. I took a path that I always call circuitous. Like, it was not a straight line from, hey, you're an engineering student who went into project engineering, who advanced through the ranks and became project manager. And so that is actually specifically not my story. My story actually starts really more at a singular class in college, and it was like the history of the environment. It was really more of a focus on civil infrastructure in our country, and that class, that professor in particular, really had a focus on the history of dams across the United States. And this was at a time when Hurricane Katrina had just come through, so dams and levees and the infrastructure of the Army Corps were really top of mind. That would become really useful and sort of kismet in my career later on. So we focused on folks like Floyd Dominy and the development of the Colorado River, and that whole aquifer to provide drinking water out west. And what it sort of dawned on me through that process is that I had become disconnected from my environment. I had become disconnected from the food web, and it gave me this sense that I needed to reconnect to understand where food came from, which led to a passion on the environmental side. So after college, because I wanted to reconnect to the food web, right? We get this distance between us from going to the supermarket, and we never have a great appreciation for what the whole animal looks like that we might be eating, or even the process of farming and all that. And I promise I'll get to how I landed where I landed today. But that put me on a salmon fishing boat in Alaska for 3 months, which really kind of gave me this diverse and unique perspective right out of the gate. And through that, my passion for the environment, excuse me. Managing my coworker here. Excuse me, guys. So anyhow, I spent some time in Alaska before I wound up ultimately moving into an environment in the Department of Defense, and then really managing from there into environmental remediation, civil construction, with a lot of focus on the land meets water environment. And that was before the energy transition just became really important to me and a bit of a passion, just as I have a young family. So that transitioned me further from remediation into decarbonization type activities and focus on the energy environment.
So I'll pause you there, because that definitely caught my interest. I didn't know actually about the boat trip. And, I think a big thing as our whole, as you know, remediation's been in our industry for a long time. And, especially going forward with a lot more work, like you said, with some of the sustainability side, some of the energy side, essentially a lot of the stuff you're doing now. How do you see the industry evolving from this? Like, what new trends are you seeing? And especially with what you're doing specifically, where do you see things heading in the future, just from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got a roadmap right now, in particular towards, I would say, like the decarbonization side of the market, right? That's going to be a process that's fraught, both from just the challenge of rebuilding our energy infrastructure, right? Is not an easy task to take on. And what's really
Mm,
important and underpinning all of that are incentives, grants, policies, which I think most of us know also underpin the traditional fossil fuel energy environment. I think from a
mm,
trend perspective, some of the things that we're seeing is that certainly at a lot of what I would call industrial type customers, and I think beyond, is you've got the role of EH&S management, right? And so what has been traditionally a compliance and safety driven activity
mm,
is now being tasked with sustainability. And so sustainability then could take on, any number of different levels of importance depending on the organization. But these managers are now being handed a new role. It makes sense given what their background already is. But it's not as though they're getting a bunch of new resources to then go meet those sustainability goals. And those goals might be certifications, they might be, reporting requirements and additional compliance needs. So we're certainly seeing a lot of demand from the industrial clients for support around that. But that's really a separate activity on the sustainability side from also then trying to green out your scope one, scope two emissions, right? So in that sense, there's a lot of activity in terms of developing whatever our baseline for scope one and scope two are and figuring out how we're going to go reach whatever targets are on the wall, whether it's a 2030 target for, net zero or a 2050, really doesn't matter. But then we also have at the same time state policy and state activities really kind of catapulting the investor-owned utilities toward exploring different pilot options to determine how they can green out their entire value chain, whether it be obviously electricity. We're looking at distributed energy resource management. How do we bring those online from the electric side? Building out the transmission grid, which really is a challenge of resources, both economic resources and just having enough engineers out there. And then beyond that, there's the gas system decarbonization problem, which, geothermal has been a major trend recently. So we've seen a lot of geothermal projects. There's a lot of interest in hydrogen. We've seen fewer projects in the hydrogen space. And that general building electrification. So, I think right now we're in one of those transitional periods that are opportunity rich. But folks are still kind of proceeding with a lot of caution because there's uncertainty with what is going to be the future, and making sure that there's a pathway to economic recovery for all of that is on the top of everyone's mind.
So I'll pause you there, and I think you brought up a great point where you have the benefit of seeing, like, on a first, hand basis, what's exactly going on. And, from your perspective for the foreseeable future, what are things going on to make, key stakeholders? Like, I know you talked about the state, the general public, do you see, in your opinion, like a greater awareness with educating them, or what's that process for you right now in getting people who are not seeing what you're seeing, on board with policies like this?
Yeah, I think you're sort of hitting the third rail there, Evan, and I mean that in a good way. It's alignment around the challenges is like the principal problem, right? And this is alignment is something I think about a lot because alignment inside of a company is what keeps sales, operations, and all of the other functional groups pulling in the same direction and trying to get to the same place, right? When you're trying to develop a project, getting alignment of a diverse group of stakeholders who all have different interests and different priorities is really a significant challenge, and we see that all the time. So I'll take an example from a project we did in Framingham, and there's been a lot published and a lot of attention on the Framingham geothermal project. It's the first of its kind, certainly in North America. Eversource did a tremendous job developing this project with CDM Smith supporting it. So we had a lot of insight, but there we had a really committed municipal group. We had a really committed set of residents who rallied around key champions in the community. We had the state supporting us from a regulatory perspective, and we had a committed customer in doing this project swiftly and doing it the right way. So that was an example of just having the exact right ingredients to make a delicious soup. I think what I've seen now on other projects, having been exposed and performed on 3 or 4 other pilot geothermal projects, is you can get to a point where a stakeholder may have more leverage than they ought to in a situation, and that leads to asks or demands, I would say, that can upset the economics of the project, right? All of a sudden, when an easement goes from a couple $100,000 to a couple $1 million, that just changes what project economics are going to be on the developer side. Recently, we saw a city council vote down the easement for a test well to be drilled in a New York City environment. And so that was really an issue where, like, very much, Evan, education is the issue, right? Like, there wasn't enough engagement, both probably by us and by the owner in that case, to walk everybody through, like, this is why your community was picked. This is all the value we see in it. And here's what we're trying to do together. So this outreach side, the stakeholder engagement side of the transition activity is actually the critical path. Like, the technology is all there, the wherewithal is all there, but getting everybody who has these varying priorities to get kind of aligned. If somebody could figure that out, they'd be effectively selling gold. So
Absolutely.
yeah, no, I think I'm happy you bring it up. It's an incredible challenge. It's the type of challenge that I lose sleep over, because projects are kind of hanging in the balance over it.
So one of the things off that, and obviously, you and your team, you're leading your team through a lot of this. For those who don't know too much about it, can you talk a little bit about your company, a little bit more about CDM Smith, a little bit more about your group, and like you said, with a lot of these projects that you're getting involved with, can you talk a little bit more about what you're doing at CDM and the group you have?
Yeah, absolutely. So for folks who aren't familiar with CDM Smith, I think we're probably best known in the water and wastewater space. So CDM Smith really came about 75 years ago, building the water plant for Cambridge in Massachusetts. Ultimately did the design work for Deer Island, for Boston, and NWRA. And it's now developed into turnkey EPC provider. So being best known then in those public spaces, really both with municipalities that would have water wastewater needs, with the federal government, EPA, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, major business in that area. I came on to help grow the industrial business unit, which is one of our smaller units, but it's certainly growing. So we're a multidisciplinary firm focused really on the EPC side of the house. We've got a specific EPC group focused on industrial style clients, because the speed at which industrial clients are moving through their FEL stages really is at a dramatically different speed than what we see in the public space. And the need to get estimates out, in the 30% design phase, we see that much more frequently. So it just requires a group that has a perspective on how to estimate work, to get numbers out so that financial decisions can be made earlier about whether or not to keep investing in a specific project. So, yeah, go ahead, Evan.
Well, just to pause you there, I think one of the things you hit nail on the head is you guys have always had like a strong team dynamic where essentially when a project like this comes in, I mean, you guys are tackling it and all that. I mean, just to highlight that a little further, if you will, because I know, with a lot of the engineers that you guys have, with a lot of the consultants that you have, I mean, you guys are working on very, very cutting edge stuff. And I mean, anything else with your team where you'd like to add where it really just sets you guys apart from a lot of the industry out there?
Yeah, we talk a lot about client service at CDM Smith, and I think that really comes to bear through our group. I mean, like the level of detail and the level of I want to say the word accuracy, but that's not quite right because that's a bit of a foregone conclusion. But the level of detail we provide through our deliverables allow owners to better understand the economics of their project early, right? So I live really on the cost side of project economics. There's an entire revenue side equation related to offtake and revenue. That's not really where just consulting engineers and EPCs make a living. We make a living really more on the cost side of the equation. But that cost side has to be married with the revenue and sales side of that business so that they have an accurate economic model of like what the future really could hold. So the ability to bring all the different disciplines together to identify the areas that are going to drive cost or help for the pickups is what's going to help make that decision making earlier in the project life cycle. And whether or not earlier in a way that gives those who are financing the project the most confidence that this is a project that can move forward.
I got to ask you, and you talked a lot about some projects you guys have done. What's a personal favorite for Tim? What's been one of the ones you look back on, or a couple that you've looked on, and it's like, hey, this was really, a really good memory for me. Like, what's some of the most enjoyable ones that you've gotten involved with?
That is that's a great question, and B, it's tough to answer. By working at CDM, I get a chance to get exposed to a really wide variety of projects. Like I've done a number of renewable natural gas projects. I've done some wastewater projects. I've done some consulting projects. We've done the geothermal work. So I've got this incredible range. And with all of them, there are things that I absolutely love because, at this point in my life, I'm probably in the peak of thinking about the environment and the future, having a young family and that sort of thing. So all of those strike a chord at some different level. But what come to mind, I've had a chance to work on two first of its kind projects at CDM Smith. One of those actually was announced last week. U.S. Steel, through its Big River Steel subsidiary, got the first designation in the world to be a responsible steel product. Okay, so that's important because this is not some greenwashing thing. This is very much like, what's your decarbonization plan look like? How do you manage biodiversity? How do you prevent adverse impacts to the habitat around you? Where do you invest in habitat? What's your impact on water resources? How do you look at water from an aggregate perspective rather than just a site perspective? So a really robust set of criteria to evaluate against, and to be part of a team that got a first in the world designation for one of these materials that is everywhere, right? Like you walk down the street and you've walked by a ton of steel, whether you're in downtown Boston or just up here in the country like me, like whether it's rebar in the street or in the houses, what have you. So I'm very proud of that. That's, softer work though than what most of my background entails, and I think the harder work or the more construction related work, I mean that certainly makes me smile. So while I was also involved in the first of the kind at Framingham, in that case I got to see a project end to end. We did the feasibility and site selection at CDM Smith. We did all the detailed design. We took that straight through the issue for design construction. The issue for bid construction. And now we've got to see that project through some construction oversight go into the ground. So one of the reasons I went from a construction background into engineering and construction combined was I really wanted the ability to be a little bit more impactful on the projects that I touched personally. And that's, I think, a really good example of being at the table to find the site, to help with the configuration of the site, to navigate some of the challenges, both from a stakeholder perspective and from a technical perspective, and then get a fully designed project that is now going to be, again, first of its kind in the United States, to look at the transition from gas to a very efficient building electrification option.
So I'm going to pause you right there, and I want to switch gears a little bit off of that to a little bit of a personal note. And I know a big thing throughout your career, you've always been very good at networking, connecting with people, learning from people, and even if someone knows more than you, asking those questions and so forth. So looking back at your career, are there any memorable moments of stuff where it's like, hey, this person was a really great mentor for me, or I got involved in this organization? So case in point, as you were building your network, as you were getting more involved in these projects, is there anything you want to share with the podcast where someone was a really good mentor for you, an organization you were part of? Like, how'd you, to where you are now and looking back, how'd you build that network for yourself?
I've had a number of mentors along the way. I don't think any of us succeed on our own. I think it was the Arnold Schwarzenegger speech, commencement speech, that was like, there's no such thing as a self-made man. And I think about that frequently, because when I do that kind of reflective look back, our networks really underpin us where we are today. They're the folks who we got to call when we've got a problem on a project that needs solving. You run through the Rolodex real quick of the folks who can help get drill cuttings off of a site when they shouldn't still be sitting there, right?
Yeah.
But from a professional perspective, I've actually been really fortunate to get exposure to incredible operators. Very early in my career, I got to work directly for a CEO of a fairly large business. We're about a $2 billion company in Department of Defense. And I was nothing more than assistant to the CEO, really supporting things like communications and messaging internally, while also trying to manage external messaging to the extent that was interesting to us. Through that, I got to meet all of the senior leadership and really a lot of the key business leaders who are charged with both making the company more efficient and helping it grow through new business lines. So the amount of exposure I got to folks, I was way too green for that to really take hold at the time. But now where I sit today, those are folks I can call on and just say, hey, I'm dealing with this problem. How would you deal with that? Or have you seen anything like it? So Steve Gaffney comes to mind without a question. Bob Delholm and Lou Scana, who were at Charter Contracting for so long, and Tony Pisanelli at the same time. All those guys were incredibly formative on my ability to just take ownership of a business division and grow it into something. Like they gave me agency and autonomy. They gave me confidence. And when you're kind of coming up through the business, you can, in your gut, have a feel for what the right decision is. And as you talk more with the senior leaders around you and get validation around that, and they give you the confidence to say, no, you can just make those decisions in the future. You do that little by little, and before you know it, you're actually kind of running whole departments, or running, in my case, the federal business unit for Charter Contracting. So those were the types of leaders that made a big difference in my life. From a networking perspective, I should absolutely give a shout out to the Society of American Military Engineers, SAME. They do an incredible job. They're an incredibly open-armed group, despite being that kind of military-ish designation. They always joke that you don't have to be American in the military or an engineer to be part of it, which I think is just the best. It truly was the case. I checked a box or so of that, but It was a group that welcomed me with open arms, and it allowed me to kind of fan out and better understand all the consulting engineers in the space at the time, and just develop relationships with everyone from firms like, WSP and AECom to the CDM Smiths of the world, and then all the way down to the small businesses like EA Engineering or Chemron and those sorts of folks. So got an incredible exposure at that point. And there's, untold other organizations that really move the needle around that. It would be hard to name them all.
So as we wrap up here, and that is phenomenal, I just want to piggyback off that. My last question to you is really sort of like a rapid fire. And, going off that, and like you said, the associations, the mentors, everything, if you were starting your career again, and it's funny because you'd expect this question to be a lot of like early career folks. I've gotten this same question from people who are more seasoned in the industry. What would you do? Like, what sort of things would you be doing? And, off of that, a big question I also get is, is there anything that Tim is reading now? Books that Tim would recommend that, really made an impact on your life?
Yeah, no, I mean, so you cut out a little bit there, so I want to make sure I get the question right. I think what you asked me is around either recommendations or tools, books, or anything that I would recommend to just anybody advancing their career at any point.
Exactly. Exactly. Right? Yep.
Yeah. There's no shortage. I'm gonna have to do the hummus for a moment as my brain kind of cycles through. I'll tell you a couple of things that I'm reading now that and that I've read recently that have an impact. So, I'm late to the game reading Poor Charlie's Almanac, but that is just a terrific book. It's humorous, and I think what's important about it is it gives some mental models for how to approach challenging unknowns. Okay, so that could be a mental model for assessing a company. That could be a mental model for assessing a market. Really, any type of like black box type of problem. So that's a book that is near and dear to my heart. There's the 80-20 principle. So I'm a big believer in first principles, with 80-20 being one of them that ranks all the time. We get 80% of our results from 20% of our output. How do we maximize the 20% of our output? And that's really just another way of saying, what are we focusing on? I've spent a lot of time in my career being unfocused, and I promise that you all can recover from that if you've been doing the same thing, because I've had to learn the hard way that every yes is also a no. If you just say yes to everything, you're saying no to your family time. You're saying no to the hobbies you want to do. And that may be okay, but like, do that with the knowledge of what you're going to also be saying no to by making those yeses. And in some cases, saying yes to going after an opportunity is going to have the cost of not going after something in parallel at the same time, or setting up for something in the future at the same time. So it's about intentionality in some ways. So the 80-20 principle is a really important book. Let's see. And then I guess finally around that, oh gosh, I'm going to blank. I'm trying to consult my cheat sheet behind me on the bookshelf. No, I'll leave it there. I would say Poor Charlie's Almanac's a great one. Go pick it up. I'm reading it now. 80-20 principle is on my desk. I refer to it frequently. Oh, and Objectives and Key Results by John Doerr. Again, a book about alignment. Like, really, really important to get aligned within your company and get aligned with your staff. Like, that's how you can manage things and bring information to the areas where decisions are made.
Absolutely. And I think just to end it off here, aside from being, a pro in the business world, Tim also is a very big family man. And, just to end it here, I mean, take out work for a sec, any hobbies that you want to share with the podcast that, once the work day's done, you really like enjoying on the weekends or whatever.
Yeah, I wind up spending a lot of time cooking. So, and it's something that I do bring my family into quite a bit. So, as Evan and I have gotten to know one another, um, we've wound up talking a lot about just where I am in life. I've got two kids under 4, and that is not too soon to teach them to use a knife, to teach them to know what different things taste like, to get in front of a stove. I mean, obviously, all this is supervised. I'm not handing him my knife or a chef's knife or anything like that. And there are plastic knives that won't cut kids. So before everyone thinks that I'm irresponsible, no, but like that's a real passion area for me. And actually, I was saying to some folks over the weekend that if I weren't able to cook, I don't know what I'd do because in business, I have my hands in a lot, but I'm not responsible for really making anything. I'm not the foreman in the field who's taking the set of plans and showing the crew, like, this is exactly where you go cut, and that's where you're going to finish. I don't make anything, but in the kitchen, I get to make things. And that's where I feel like I'm at kind of my creative peak, to be honest, because I get a chance to experiment. I get a chance to try new things. Some of it is a complete and utter failure, but it helps engage with the family and it nourishes everybody. So I get a lot of satisfaction out of that.
I love that. And guys, Tim is being very humble because my cooking skills are terrible. I burn water and all that. But Tim, truly from the bottom of my heart, thanks for being on today and, sharing a lot of your insight and sharing a little bit about your career. And like you said, the mentors and everything you've done. Guys, what I'm going to do is once we publish this episode, I'm going to tag Tim and his contact info if any of you want to get in contact with him after this is launched. But Tim, thanks for being on today.
Appreciate it, Evan. Have a great week. Thanks, guys.
All right. That's a wrap.